I was standing outside the Pantheon in Rome, the late afternoon light casting golden shadows on ancient stone, when my phone buzzed. It was Mason. I almost didn't pick up. We'd barely spoken since I left the States 3 weeks earlier to keynote a sustainability design conference. He hadn't even replied when I sent him photos of the villa I'd toured in Tuscany. But something in my chest, some instinct I couldn't explain, made me answer. His voice was calm. Too calm. "Hey," he said. "Listen, I just wanted you to know I've sold the beach house. And I think it's time we stop pretending. I'm filing for divorce. Kalani and I are moving in together. I hope this doesn't come as too much of a shock." There was a long pause, the kind of silence that begs for a reaction. I looked up at the dome of the Pantheon, a structure that survived centuries of storms, conquest, even renovation after betrayal. And then I said, just as calm, "I understand." He didn't know. He didn't know what I'd done. He didn't know that 10 months earlier, while he was too busy flirting with spiritual healing workshops and spending weekends in Malibu with his so-called yoga coach, I'd already taken care of what mattered most. Not the marriage. The house. And this is how I did it. Before we jump in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. It wasn't always like this. When I first met Mason, he was magnetic. A lifestyle photographer with just enough scruff to look artistic and just enough charm to convince a room he cared. I was 35, fresh off designing my first solo luxury property in Napa, and he photographed the project for Architectural Digest. We met on site. He complimented the curve of the staircase before he even looked me in the eye. "You designed this?" he asked, that easy grin spreading. "It's like serenity carved in concrete." I should have known right then. But I was tired of men who talked numbers, who led with their LinkedIn profiles. Mason seemed different. Free. Present. Or maybe, back then, I wanted to be seen more than I wanted to be safe. We were married within 18 months. The beach house came later. A Victorian-style retreat on the cliffs of Cambria, perched just enough off the grid to feel like escape. I designed every inch, arched windows that framed the ocean, a reading loft tucked beneath the eaves, sun-washed cedar floors that warmed your bare feet even in winter. I poured love into that house. Mason poured wine. At first, it was charming. Dinner parties with friends. Candid shots of me sketching floor plans as he sipped a Syrah and framed the scene. But somewhere around year 7, things shifted. He started staying in LA longer. Post-production edits turned into week-long absences. The woman who used to call for photo licensing issues started calling at 11:30 p.m. Her name was Kalani. She had a lilting voice and an Instagram full of chakra quotes and sun-drenched selfies. I didn't need a private investigator to tell me what I already felt in my gut. But I didn't react. Not yet. Because one thing I know, better than most, is how to plan for impact. While Mason drifted further into whatever phase of midlife delusion he was in, I sat with my lawyer, Patricia Lynn, and we quietly moved the deed of the beach house into an irrevocable land trust under my name. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't even confrontational. It was structural. Because if you want something to last, whether it's a home or your peace, you lay the foundation before the storm comes. I was in Lisbon when Mason finally made his move. 3 days into a week-long design summit, presenting on sustainable waterfront architecture, I stepped out of the conference hall to catch my breath. My phone buzzed, his name on the screen, first call in days. I almost didn't answer. But I did. His voice was low, like he'd rehearsed it in the mirror. Calm. Almost bored. "Hey," he said. "Just wanted to let you know. I've sold the beach house. Kalani and I are moving to Maui. I've filed for divorce. Thought it was better you heard from me directly." There was a pause. A silence so still it seemed like the city around me muted itself. Then I said, "Thanks for the call." That was it. I could feel him waiting for a reaction, rage, tears, begging. But I gave him nothing. Because there's something deeply unnerving about a woman who doesn't flinch when you expect her to fall apart. I hung up and turned toward the Atlantic. It looked calm from where I stood. But I knew better than anyone, just because the water looks still doesn't mean there's not a storm churning beneath. Back in my hotel room, I dialed Patricia. She picked up on the first ring. He did it, I said. He thinks he sold the house. There was a pause, then a quiet laugh. Oh honey, she said, I hope he told his buyer to keep the receipt. By the end of the day, the so-called sale had been frozen, flagged by the trust's protection clause. Mason hadn't sold a thing. He'd just exposed how little he understood about the woman he once married. I spent the next 2 days in Lisbon exactly as planned, presenting, networking, sipping espresso by the river at dusk. Let him believe he'd won. Let him pack his bags and plan his new life under the illusion of victory. Meanwhile, I was already sketching what would come next. And trust me, it was going to be beautiful. I landed in Boston just after midnight. The air was cold and briny, that particular kind of coastal sharpness that always reminded me of late summer at the beach house, when Mason and I used to pretend we were something closer than we really were. I didn't go home. I went straight to the house. The lights were on. A black Escalade I didn't recognize sat in the driveway, backed in like the driver wanted a quick getaway. Through the front windows, I could see movement, soft, warm lighting, the sound of laughter spilling through the cracked back doors. They were having a party. I parked down the street, slipped off my heels, and walked barefoot up the gravel path I designed myself. I knew which stones would be loud, which ones would cushion my steps. I approached the French doors from the garden side, the ones that opened straight onto the deck I spent 2 summers restoring by hand. I paused. Inside, Mason was pouring drinks. Kalani, barefoot, in one of my old linen robes, was dancing to music I used to play while designing homes in that very sunroom. There were strangers lounging in chairs I picked out, wine glasses resting on the reclaimed wood coffee table I built from our first renovation. It was surreal. Like watching an amateur playhouse try to reenact a life that never truly belonged to them. Then Mason saw me. The glass slipped from his hand and shattered across the floor. The room stilled, all laughter evaporating. Kalani froze mid-step, eyes wide, lips parting but no words coming. Don't stop on my account, I said, stepping inside. You look like you were having such a good time. Mason's voice cracked first. What are you doing here? I held up a manila envelope and laid it gently on the table, right on top of their half-empty charcuterie board. This, I said, is a copy of the property trust. You never owned this house. You never could have sold it. The sale is void. You might want to call your buyer before he sues you for fraud. Kalani blinked. Wait, what? I turned to her, calm. You were moving in next week, right? I suggest you find somewhere else. There are plenty of rentals off-island. Mason stepped forward. You tricked me. You lied. I met his eyes, steady. No, Mason. I planned. You just didn't pay attention. He looked so small in that moment, standing in the very house he tried to erase me from, only now realizing it was never his to take. I didn't need to raise my voice. The walls did it for me. The next morning, I met with my attorney, Andrea Collins, in her downtown office overlooking the harbor. She already had the espresso waiting, black, just how I liked it, and the documents laid out in careful order across the marble table. Andrea tapped a thick folder with a manicured nail. There's more, Kaia. You were right to come home. She slid it toward me. Inside, bank statements. Withdrawals totaling just under $300,000 from our joint account, done in small increments over 6 months. Mason had been bleeding our savings dry, not for survival, but to fund his next adventure. A chain of email printouts came next. One thread between Mason and Kalani's brother, Nico, a shady real estate developer from Miami I'd heard about once in passing, usually followed by the words "under investigation." I skimmed the messages, my heart growing colder with every line. He was going to use the beach house as collateral, Andrea said. Secure a loan for a boutique resort in Florida. I closed the folder. Mason doesn't build things, I said quietly. He consumes them. The only reason he was able to sell the idea to investors is because he wrapped it in something I created. Andrea leaned forward. We can go after him for financial misrepresentation. Fraud. You'd win. I shook my head. I don't want revenge. I want leverage. And I already knew how to get it. That afternoon, I met with Sophie, my longtime friend and financial planner, at a small cafe we used to haunt before Mason came into the picture. Over cappuccinos and biscotti, I told her everything. I want to move fast, I said. We freeze the accounts, protect the LLC tied to the house, and I want eyes on anything Mason tries to transfer or sell. Anything. Sophie nodded. We'll need to notify the state registry and file a cease and desist against the Miami firm too. I smiled. Do it. She paused, then added, he really thought he won. I looked out the window, watching the clouds roll over the water. Let him think that a little longer, I said. It makes what comes next even sweeter. That Friday, I drove down to the beach house. Not to reclaim it, not yet, but to see what Mason had done in my absence. The sun was just setting, casting golden coral across the front veranda. And there it was, her car. A sleek black convertible, parked in my driveway. Kalani's. The girl who used to carry my coffee orders and now thought she could carry my life. I walked right up to the front door and knocked, twice, calm, controlled. After a moment, she answered, barefoot, wearing one of my linen shirts like a badge of conquest. Her face dropped. Kaia? I smiled. Expecting someone else? She stepped back instinctively. Mason's not here. That's fine. I'm not here for him. I walked past her before she could decide if she had the right to stop me. The house smelled different now, candles that were too sweet, plastic floral arrangements in place of my orchids. Even the art had been rearranged. But she hadn't touched the kitchen. Of course she hadn't. That space was mine in every bone and brick. The floor tiles? I designed them. The stove? Imported. The lighting above the island? Hand-blown glass from Murano. I knew every inch like a second skin. Kalani stood in the doorway, arms crossed. You can't just walk in here. You're right, I said, turning to face her. You should be the one walking out. I placed a thick envelope on the counter. These are the trust documents, I said. This house was transferred out of our joint ownership 10 months ago. Mason signed it. You'll find his signature on page 6. She blinked, stunned. He said it was his. He says a lot of things. Her voice wavered. We already started packing. We were going to move in after the renovation. There won't be a renovation. There won't be a move-in. I stepped closer, my tone still level, razor sharp. This isn't your beginning. It's your wake-up call. The front door opened behind her. Mason. He froze when he saw me. His face drained of color. Kaia. I turned slowly. Mason. His mouth opened, searching for words, for a tone that might still work on me. But I spoke first. You can keep the clothes, the boat, even your little fantasy resort in Miami. But this house? I leaned forward, lowering my voice. This house was never yours to give. I stepped around him and walked out the door, the cool evening air greeting me like an old friend. Let them sit in that silence. It was time they heard the truth echoing off the walls I built. The next morning, Diane and I met at her office before the sun had fully risen. The building was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels like a held breath before the hammer falls. She slid a folder across the desk toward me. We traced the funds, she said, voice tight. Mason didn't just empty your savings, he funneled nearly $250,000 into a shell corporation registered under the name Bayfront Revival LLC. I raised an eyebrow. Let me guess. The managing partner is related to Kalani? Her brother. Kai Matthews. No experience in real estate, but suddenly listed as a development director on 3 separate projects across Florida. All filed in the last 6 months. I let out a soft, humorless laugh. He really thought he was building an empire off my back. And now, Diane added, tapping the folder, we have enough to take legal action. Fraud. Breach of fiduciary duty. Possibly even conspiracy. I closed the folder. Let's move. We filed the papers that same day. Diane moved quickly, she always did when something crossed the line from unethical to illegal. By Monday morning, a temporary injunction had frozen the account Mason used for his little empire, and our legal notice was delivered to both him and Kalani by courier. I didn't hear from Mason until 2 nights later. He called from a number I didn't recognize, probably trying to avoid my attorney's record logs. I let it ring. He tried again. Then again. The 3rd time, I picked up. Kaia, he started, breathless. Look, this is out of control. No, I interrupted. What's out of control is your belief that you could sell my home, steal my money, lie to my face, and come out of this clean. His voice cracked, you blindsided me with those trust documents. You set me up. No, I said. I protected myself. You set yourself up the moment you looked at my work, my home, my life, and thought you were entitled to any of it. A beat of silence. Then. I never meant to hurt you. Funny, I said, you said the same thing when you forgot my birthday the year my mother died. He went quiet again. Then, softly, what happens now? You get a lawyer, I said, and pray he's better than your judgment. I hung up. And for the first time in months, maybe years, I felt still. Whole. Steady. Like the foundation had stopped shifting beneath me. The storm had passed. But I was just getting started. 6 months later, the house felt different. The same ocean breeze still drifted through the porch, but something had shifted. Maybe it was the absence of Eric's cologne, or the fact that the guest room no longer held boxes of secrets. Maybe it was the peace that came with knowing that everything had finally fallen into place, on her terms. Kaia stood barefoot on the veranda, a mug of tea in her hand, watching the tide pull in slowly under a soft gray sky. A soft jazz record played in the background, and the old hammock swayed just slightly in the wind. The house was still hers. And not just in deed or law. She had reclaimed every inch of it, with purpose, with fire, and with grace. The final court hearing had gone exactly as her attorney predicted. Eric, caught in his own paper trail of lies and shady property transfers, tried to play innocent. But Kaia's quiet preparations had spoken louder than his theatrics. The house remained in her name, the judge ruling the sale invalid. And when his offshore account activity came to light, he lost far more than just her trust. He lost his license, his second home, and his reputation. Jessica, the woman who once paraded barefoot through Kaia's garden in a robe that didn't belong to her, disappeared shortly after the hearing. No one saw her again. And perhaps that was justice in its own quiet way. Kaia had turned down media requests. She wasn't interested in being a headline or an example. But she did say yes to something else, a scholarship fund in her mother's name, for young women in architecture from underserved communities. It started with $250,000, what Eric had tried to hide in a failed Miami investment, and would grow from there. A knock sounded gently at the door. Sophie, her property manager, stepped inside with 2 cappuccinos and a grin. Singapore approved your concept pitch. You're booked to fly out next month. Kaia smiled and took the cup, warm between her fingers. I'll go. But not to run. This time, I'm building something new. And then she did what she hadn't done in years, walked down to the shore, rolled up her jeans, and let the waves wash over her feet. The same beach where her marriage began, where it unraveled, and where she now stood entirely on her own. Sometimes, what you think is the end of a story, is just the moment you take back the pen. So if you've ever been told you're too soft, too trusting, or too slow to see betrayal coming, let Kaia remind you, slow isn't weak. Slow is deliberate. And sometimes, the most powerful move is the one they never see coming. If this story stirred something in you, don't forget to hit subscribe to True Tales. We're building a community of powerful women who rise, rebuild, and reclaim, one story at a time.